This is Writing Excuses Q&A.
This is the video feed you've all been waiting for.
I'm Mary Robinette.
I'm Howard.
And we have questions that have come to us from our Patreon supporters. So if you want to get one of your questions answered, the best way to do that is to support us on Patreon. Also, it's just kind of nice of you. Starting us off tonight, the first question is apparently someone who's been waiting for me to come back to do these.
That one.
I've been traveling a lot. Mary Robinette, can you explain more about trauma attachment points when you talk about super objective? I understand safety, but I'm confused about how to use the other two. Okay, so what this is talking about is something that I picked up from my therapist, which was that there are trauma attachment points that we all have, and they are things that probably happened to you when you were in your childhood that you may or may not remember. But what's nice about them is that they form this really useful thing that you can use to torture your characters or to get a sense of character consistency. So they are safety, empowerment, and connection. So safety is something that happened that made you feel unsafe. This is going to lead to you doing things like locking doors, taking kung fu. I don't know. Empowerment, something made you feel powerless. There's often sometimes there's overlap between these two things, between any of these. So empowerment will be things like you wanted to do a thing and were told that you could not. So this can lead to people who you can either overcompensate or kind of lean into embrace. So a loss of empowerment can mean that you always look for other people to lead, or it can mean that you always want to be in charge, or something in some other form of that. Connection means that something happened that made you feel alone in some way, or that you couldn't trust people, a child abandonment things. So again, this can mean that you become super outgoing as a way to compensate for that, or that you do not form attachments to other people because they may be taken away from you. And there's a whole range, and you get to decide. But once you've made that decision, then when you're looking at how your character is reacting to one of the new contemporary traumas that you, the writer, are inflicting on them, you can take a look at how they're responding. So one of the examples that I use sometimes is Tony Stark. Tony Stark's big thing is connection. Like, he's not worried about empowerment. He's not particularly, safety, maybe a little bit, but mostly it's connection. So what does he do? He uses his smarts to build a best friend, to build a robot. Is it Jarvis? Jarvis, who's just always available for him. And that's the kind of thing that you're looking for. It's like, how does this person react? He uses his money to basically buy friends. So,
looking at Tony Stark, that's a great example, because the first Avengers movie ends with him making the sacrifice play to save Earth from an invasion. The second Avengers movie, Age of Ultron, our crisis arises because Tony Stark does not feel like Earth is safe. He had trauma, and Wanda actually exploits that with a little, illusion she casts on him, to the point that when we get to Infinity War and Endgame, Tony Stark's responses in both of those cases are, I told you guys, we needed a suit of armor around the world, and you said no. Mm-hmm. And here we are. And it tracks perfectly.
Yeah, but he's also very much driven by the choices of his love for Pepper and his child. That those things, and his love for the Avengers, that connection is also one of the things that drives him. So that's one of the things you can do with it, is you can use it to identify stumbling blocks for your character, things that are going to cause them to nope out. But you can also use it to identify pressure points that are going to push them forward through the plot. Shall we move on to another question?
I think we should.
All right. So this is an interesting one. This is about series. Um, uh, so when people tend to watch long running series, they tend to be upset when characters keep making the same mistakes again. Um, how do you think about this when doing your own work?
Well, I come from the genre where this problem is the most visibly manifest, from comics. You know, Superman, Spider-Man, they don't really get character arcs that last because they're a franchise. One writer might give them a little arc, might get a series that's awesome, but then we have to have a reboot because Spider-Man isn't Spider-Man unless he's a teenager. If Spider-Man grows up, he stops. It breaks the franchise. The money stops flowing. Marvel is not going to let that happen. We have to keep having Spider-Man be a teenager. So, I mean, this has been on my mind since the very beginning of Schlock Mercenary, and I realized, perhaps a little later than I should have, that if I'm controlling the franchise, I can grow the characters however I want them to grow. I am allowed to change them. I remember about 3/4 of the way through, one of the neighbor kids was over here for some reason or another and whined at me and said, why did Schlock have to grow a conscience? Oh, I don't want to say I'm glad that upset you, but I'm very glad that you noticed that it's there.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was tired of him not having one, and it made for me a really fun story.
Yeah.
And it made for good callbacks. And so, the question, how do you think about this when doing your own work? The thought is in two parts. Part one is, if it is indeed my own work, if I'm not working within a franchise, then I use whatever tools are at my disposal to make the characters have arcs that are satisfying to me, that are satisfying to my beta readers. And if that traumatizes the poor franchise, well, life is trauma. Anybody who tells you otherwise is lying.
Well, I think what you said about arcs is really one of the keys here. That what you're looking for, I think, is consistencies. So a character can change and change in a believable manner. That often when we see a character change too much, the you have not been shown the stages of that change, so it feels very abrupt. So if you're thinking about an arc that's taking place, the one that I tend to use, I got from Elizabeth Boyle, which is I call it DREAM, denial, resistance, exploration, acceptance, and manifestation. And what's great about this is that you can have someone go through these stages kind of slowly. And one of the things that will happen is that the character will often think that they've solved whatever problem it is that they had. See if I can actually spell manifestation before I put this banner up for you. What's so they may think, and this is the one that I sometimes use, which is very rude. Oh, I'm not a writer. Well, yeah, I write sometimes, but I'm not a writer. Okay, fine. I'll take a class. Sure, I'll take a class. Absolutely. At the end of the class, oh, I think I'm a writer. I think I'm gonna manifestation. I'm gonna submit a story, but I'm not a writer. Because a writer, so one of the things that happens is that as the character is trying to grow, that goalpost shifts. And so for me, when the character when a character changes too much, the thing that happens is that the writer has shifted sort of what their internal, or when I'm trying to keep it from happening myself, I try to make sure that their internal goal, either their attachment point or like their super objective, the big picture thing, the thing that they want overall, that's still fairly consistent. It's like, I want to be with people. But the way in which they want to be with people changes. And then the ones that don't change and keep making the same mistakes over and over again, the reason that's annoying is because it's annoying in real life. You want people to learn, you want them to grow some. So I try to make sure that when you look at the Elma in Calculating Stars, her anxiety is something that will be with her for her entire life. Her relationship with it changes. Her triggers will kind of change over time as she learns coping mechanisms, as she becomes, she acquires different traumas. But the what will people think, that's kind of in her core that she can never quite get rid of. It's like, what will people think that I'm a lady who likes to fly planes? And it's like, all right, I'm a lady who likes to fly planes. What will people think if I don't do it well? And then later, when it's clear that she does it well, it's like, oh, I'm an astronaut, but what will people think if I try to take the spotlight? And then what will people think if I don't take the spotlight? So that's how I kind of manage it in my own work.
Yeah, one of the shortcuts that I take is just asking myself a question about the current character and the previous installments. Is this character acting like somebody who got shot in the last book?
Mm-hmm.
Is this character acting like somebody who broke up with the love of their life 3 books ago?
Yeah. Logical cause.
I mean, there's a whole bunch of things you can do that are 3 layers down, exploring the, connection points and traumas and all of this other stuff. But for me, often the shortcut is to ask what they're like after that thing that the reader knows happened.
Yeah, exactly.
I was talking about the Daniel Craig James Bond movies earlier. And there's a moment in the most recent one where the new 007, played by Lashana Lynch, I think, says to Daniel Craig, says to James, "I will shoot you right in the knee, the one that still works." And it's such a nice moment because she knows he's old and broken up.
Mm-hmm.
And it's good for us not to forget that.
Yeah.
He's not a young man anymore.
Yeah. I love things like that. All right. Next one. I've paraphrased this one. I want to write a character with a different background than my own. How can I prepare for this book? So in the question, there's things like, talking to people from that background. Are there any other good steps? And that the writer wants to be thoughtful and open. So there's a bunch of different things. One is one of the things that I have found very useful when I am preparing to write someone who has a different background is that we tend to lean into the pain. And when you are writing a story that is based on the pain that belongs to another group and not to you, then you're profiting from someone else's pain. It's not that you can't have it in there, but if that is the central point of the story, it may just not be your story to tell. But one of the other piece of that is that we often forget to look for the joy, the things that that define happiness. And I find that that's often a more useful entry, because those then all become things that I can threaten as an author. Speaking of, I don't know if you can hear that. My beloved cat has just said treat. Hello. Speaking of things that make us happy. Um, so that's, oh, Elsie, this is a very bad plan. Are you going to try that anyway? Sorry, I have a small cat, and I have just gotten a new wastebasket, and all that's in the bottom is the tissue paper that I used to blot my lipstick. And she was about to try to get into the trash can, and I do not think that it was a fits situation. Uh, so she's changed her mind. So, what were we talking about? Oh, right. Um, so you can also engage an expert, uh, subject matter expert. This is often called a sensitivity reader. I will often engage someone at the beginning before I actually start writing to make sure that I'm not baking in any plot elements that are going to be a problem later. And then afterwards, I'll come back and ask them to look at it. The other trick that I'll use is I will get a magazine that is targeted to the group, and I will read it cover to cover, including the ads. Um, these are not all of the things, but these are often useful entry points. I'm also going to recommend the classes at Writing the Other, and the book Writing the Other. This is a great way to uh, to to like, these are people who the folks who teach that, Nisi Shawl, who wrote the original book. Um, this is someone who's thought deeply about how to approach this in a thoughtful, systematic manner.
Yeah, I come down to a two-step process where step number one is to gather as much own voice information as I can. And step number two is to have somebody who does not owe me a smile or the time of day check my work.
Mm-hmm.
It's, for me, everything sort of falls into one of those two. I guess the third is I also have to give myself permission to decide not to do the project,
Yeah.
or to fail at it and accept that, I did everything I could. I didn't want to create something that hurt other people, but I screwed up, and I just need to be prepared to own that. And you don't need to be writing, other people in order to screw up and write something that hurts people. There are so many ways to do a bad job at this job we've picked. And I feel like that third step, you just have to be willing to own up rather than doubling down.
Yeah, I think that's, if people go back into the archives, I don't know exactly where it is, but you can hear me talk about having decided to discard a project. Now, I want to be clear that writing a thing because it's important to you and publishing a thing are two different things. I think you can write anything you want. It's when you get to the publishing stage that you really need to ask, or writing something with the intention to publish, that you really need to ask the question of whether or not, why you were doing it, and who you were writing it, who you're trying to write it for. All right, shall we move on?
Yes.
My coworker recently told me I ought to start a blog, but I don't know the first thing about blogging. Where does a late 20s amateur writer go to blog these days? I have no idea. I mean, your own website.
It's a funny story. 15, 17 years ago, I don't know how many years ago it was, Brandon Sanderson's brother said to Brandon, "You should start a podcast." And and he decided to, and I got roped into that, and I have no regrets. I can't promise you that starting a blog will be a rewarding long-term thing, but I feel very strongly that writing in such a way that other people can find it and read it is one of the most fundamentally human things we can do. We, we say things, and we get people to listen to those things and maybe say things back. But on a technical, more technical standpoint, I have very strong opinions about the current suite of turnkey user-generated content systems, because anything like, I mean, it's not a blogging engine, but YouTube or Twitch or any of the social media sites, Tumblr, Instagram, any of these, they own your page, they own your audience, and that's not a great place for you to put yourself. And so whatever you do, I would encourage you to have your own domain that you own, and a technology underneath it that you can swap out if you need to, some sort of content management system. It's kind of old school, but get a domain and host a WordPress site on it. That still works. People will scream that, oh, WordPress is old school. Why are you using WordPress? You should use Squarespace. You should use what? Guys, if the goal is for you to be able to write a thing so that other people can find it on a website, the technology underpinning the content management aspect isn't really that important. The important bit is you want to own the domain, and you want to be able to swap out the technology without losing your audience. So
yeah, and it also depends on what your purpose of blogging is. Like, are you blogging because you want to share content? Are you doing it because you want to build an audience? Like, why are you blogging? Because you can also do a lot with microblogging these days. For that, I would probably be doing Blue Sky.
Yep.
And then there's video blogging, for that, like TikTok, Instagram, YouTube. So it really depends.
I do Blue Sky, and lately very little else, but everything that I do, my profile links back to domains that I own: schlockmercenary.com, howardtaylor.com. So that, if we have, as we had in the Musk apocalypse of Twitter, people might not know how to find everybody, but if they know my name, they know how to find me.
Yeah. And newsletters are also a really good way to go too. Hey, can I have my hand back? Thank you. Yes, Elsie has decided to join us, mostly because that way she's not using her buttons to.
What is that color scheme on a cat called? Is that?
She's a calico.
Calico.
So all cats are orange or brown or black. Now you're getting too much information. It's calico. Calico is a tortoiseshell with white on it. They're only girls because the colors are carried on the X chromosome, and so you can have a black and an orange happening at the same time. Everything else is even a gray cat, technically a black cat. So I can go. Fun fact, I wanted to be a veterinarian specializing in cats when I was a small child.
I think one of my favorite cat quotes: "At night, all cats are black."
I was once in a theater. They were giving us a tour, and the walls were painted red. And he was like, "Would you like to know why the walls are painted red?" I'm like, "Yeah, It's like, because red is darker when the lights are off. And I'm like, I think most colors are darker when the lights are off. Okay. How do you determine what world building to include on page or off page? Does the answer vary if a writer is an outliner versus a pantser?
That's a little like asking, does the answer vary from one writer to another? Because yes. How do I do it? If the world building is important to the plot, if, for instance, we're having a heist and elves can't get into this vault because the vault's made of iron and they just can't touch the iron, then at some point prior to that being important, I have to say something about elves and iron. That world building has to be on the page.
Yeah.
Do I have to say anything about how the language of the elves was influenced by metallurgy? Maybe. It might add flavor. It might act in support of this nigh elf impenetrable vault. But ultimately, if the world building is in support of a key plot point, it belongs on the page. If it's not in support of a key plot point, take this opportunity to decide whether or not the reader needs to be troubled with it. It might be really fun for you, and it might work well as an aside that flavors things, but it does not need to be part of an expository paragraph.
Right. To go a little bit further, I also agree if it's related to the plot. And for me, the questions that I ask is it supporting a question of why they're doing this? Is it supporting a question of what their goal is? And is it supporting a question of what their plan is to achieve that goal? If it's supporting one of those three things, then it's probably important. If it's important, giving you a character backstory, is that character backstory related to one of those three things? Those are plot-driven things. I also think that tone is an important thing. And so I do think that including world building that is purely decorative is actually an important part of the process, because it's your set dressing. The analogy that I use comes from my puppetry days, which is that when I was building puppets, I did not build puppets that were anatomically correct, except occasionally when I wanted to mess with one of the other puppeteers. But the reason I didn't is because everything that I put in the puppet was weight that the performer was going to have to carry, that the audience was not going to see. So I was going to have to make them exert effort, and the audience would have no reason to know it. Like, it would have no effect on the audience's awareness of the story. When you're writing, the audience is collaborating with you. In many ways, they are your puppeteer and you are providing tools for them. They have to build the world in their head based on the words that you put on the page. So when you ask them to carry something that doesn't affect the story that you're telling, you're asking them to carry extra narrative weight that they then have to support all the way through the story. So that's one of the reasons that I often try to, why I will often think about that. The other piece that I will think about when I'm having that kind of conversation with myself about, oh, do I include this world building detail, is like, oops, sorry about that. If I have to spend more than 2 or 3 sentences explaining it, in order to get the reader to understand it, I'm probably putting in more effort than I need to, based on what I'm trying to support.
Yeah, there's I'm going to paraphrase it, and I can't remember who said it first, but it comes down to, it was a question for artists. Do you love drawing, street scenes and, strong perspective in architecturally accurate skyscrapers? Because if you don't, you are not allowed to touch Spider-Man. Spider-Man cannot be Spider-Man without the set dressing of skyscrapers.
Yeah.
It just doesn't work. Which building is which usually doesn't matter, but just Spider-Man moving through a scene, we got to have skyscrapers in it.
Yeah.
And I think that applies nicely to the world building.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the rest of it is, does the answer vary if the writer is an outline or a pantser? I don't think so, ultimately, because the way you get to the final product doesn't actually matter. The question you're asking, what you include on the page or off the page, the first part of that is about the final product that you give to the reader. How you get to that doesn't affect the final product. All right. Here's the last of the questions that we got in from our Patreon supporters. How often do you find yourself working on multiple projects at the same time? E.g., or example, drafting one while editing another, and how do you manage it?
Always badly.
Reasonable. Yes, I do wind up doing this. There's a couple of different tools that I'll use depending. Like I am often the page pass proofs for a novel that I'm, whatever the last novel, the next novel to come out to be published, usually land while I am drafting something new. And so I will often put the other novel down, the new novel down, and just binge on the page pass proofs because they have like a 2-week turnaround. And they have there's usually a really fast turnaround on that. Sometimes I can't put things down because I have 2 things that have overlapping deadlines. And so then I usually try to separate it with some sort of physical activity. And then when I come back to the work, I try to reorient by reading through what I wrote in my last session. If I'm writing fiction, then I will often think about what is a sensory detail, because that helps me ground me in the scene. And what is my character actually trying to do right now? So those are things that tools that I tend to go back to over and over again. But there are other ones out there. It's annoying, but the farther you get in your career, the more likely to do it.
I have spreadsheets and spreadsheets and spreadsheets. One of the most useful tricks I learned was how to make a color changing checkbox in a spreadsheet, so that I can just make a big project management thing in a spreadsheet. And if the project gets more complex, I add another tab and more checkboxes. And it's silly, but opening a tab and seeing, oh my gosh, there's a bunch of red things with empty squares. Oh no. And then reading and realizing, oh goodness, I really did. I dropped the ball on this. I have to pick that up again.
Yeah.
But I mean, we all, to some degree, I say we all, I'm wrong. It's not everybody. But creative multitasking, each day, I need to write, I need to draw, and I often need to cook. Well, those are all tasks that involve some measure of creativity. Mm-hmm. This evening, as part of the, because we were doing this, I told Sandra, I haven't eaten since breakfast. I need to eat. I'm not going to have brain after we're done. And she said, all right, I'll go get you a burger. And so I devoured a burger before this began. So the multitasking was helped along by somebody who understands my process. There's also a term that I picked up from my friend Dave a decade and a half ago, chop wood, carry water. There are some tasks that don't require as much thinking, provided I've queued everything up. And that's shorthand that Sandra and I will use all the time. Oh, I need to ink that. But you know what? All the composition is done. That's just chop wood, carry water.
Hmm.
I can do that while sitting with you and watching TV.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I like right now I am drafting a new short story and I am um, getting ready to dive back into a novel that, for reasons I had set down for a while, for a couple of years actually. And so I draft short story, Sundays I'll time block, like Sunday morning, 9 to 11. And then that's because that's the time that I am, my brain is most alert. And for picking up the novel that I set down for a while, I just have to reread it and make notes to myself at this point. When I get into actually needing to draft new words and to start to move things around to solve for the choices that I need to make in this, then I'm going to have to. That's when I'm going to need to move it into my prime operating time.
yeah, I've found that it's really helpful to use a calendar as a journaling / diagnostic tool. Um, I don't try and plan my day. I don't try and plan what's going to happen at every hour or 3 hours or whatever. I work on what needs to be worked on. But if I am worried that things keep falling through the cracks, I'm not being productive enough, I will spend a week and I will commit to at least twice a day opening up the calendar and actually documenting how I spent my time. And
Yeah.
that is such a useful diagnostic to tell me, oh, well, there's this one thing that I'm working on that just tends to rabbit hole me and chew up 4 hours that were way more valuable than the piece of the project I'm spending them on.
Yeah.
I mean, we could talk for hours and hours and hours about
Yes.
time management and task swapping and project tracking and
Yeah, and I will say that things that allow you to time manage other projects in the rest of your life, work on writing. Um, it's important to also remember to that works for your brain um, does not have to be what works for someone else's. Yeah. All right, I'm going to grab a question from the chat, since we actually have a little bit of extra time. And then speaking of food, I'm going to go because my delegation was that I ordered pizza tonight instead of cooking.
oh, nice. What kind of pizza?
It is it's a vegan supreme.
Okay.
Are white cats orange or black? Yes, actually. They are orange or black. The thing that causes white on a cat is so Elsie, who's asleep down here, the white on a calico is, I can't remember the name of the gene and its expression, but basically the white, the orange and the black are still there. It's just this kind of um, overwrites them a little bit. Like my gray hair, still at base, redhead. And so white cats still at base are orange or black.
But there's something happening in the follicle at the cellular or whatever level that's saying, hey, you know what? We're not going to express that color.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a bunch of there's a bunch of other variations that will happen about how a color, how the color expresses. Like there's a thing that happens with Siamese that causes them to darken based on the temperature in their mother's body while they were kittens, while they were in the womb. It's this whole thing. I do not need to get this deep into it, but you asked, and that was your choice. All right. I see one other question that I want to go ahead and grab, and then we will, I think, call it a night. What do I do if I constantly can't decide about whether to do my story idea in a graphic novel format or a regular novel? I like and am decent at both, but the story doesn't have an obvious better option. Both. Do the one that speaks to you in the moment. The wonderful thing about writing is that you can take the same story, write it, and sell it in multiple formats. So you do not need to worry about giving up one of them because you are because you're working in another. So for me personally, like if it were me and I had both of those options, I would probably just bounce back and forth between them until I found, like whichever one is giving you more traction in the moment, and then adapt from that to the other form when you get to the form of to the point where you're ready to try to clean it up and sell it. But for the creation process, use both. Here's the example that I sometimes use. Shades of Milk and Honey, my novel, was originally a piece of flash fiction. And then I adapted it to be a radio play, which is a really brilliant idea for a magic system that is visual. And then eventually into a novel. Ship Who Sang by Anne McCaffrey, originally a short story. Sold it both ways. Dragon Riders of Pern, originally a short story. Ghost Stalkers, again, one of my novels. That was, I had originally had 2 short stories with that character and then a novel. I have done things that began as puppet shows and then went into fiction and then back into, so like you can mix and match and you can still sell it in multiple
Snow
formats.
Crash was originally a graphic novel.
Oh yeah. I actually did not know that.
Yeah.
Huh.
Read the first page.
I'm so clear with that. Oh my God.
I know. You read the first page of Snow Crash after learning that and you're like, oh.
Obvious.
Oh, obvious. Yeah.
Yeah.
I will often come to, it's especially when we're talking about comics, I will often ask, what is it that this medium can do for this story that another medium can't?
Yes.
And the thing that comics can do that no other medium can is the page turn reveal. Because when you turn the page in comics, the whole page spread is absorbed by your brain at once before you read the words.
Yep.
You can do it picture as fast as we can see those pictures.
Yeah.
And so a good writer of comics, especially, a good writer who's working with a good illustrator, knows how to exploit that. So that on the page turn, the reveal happens the way the reveal is supposed to happen.
Yeah.
If you are not interested in doing that kind of thing, then another format might work just fine. But if you are trying to write a story that in your mind has, like beautiful watercolor pastel, cherry blossom sorts of pictures, well, you can communicate some of that with words, but the gorgeousness of watercolor cherry blossom pastel pictures is going to be lost on anything except a graphic novel that was done in watercolors.
Right.
So,
and likewise, if you want to do a lot of stuff with character interiority, that is a place where novels are and short prose fiction is extremely good.
And it doesn't work well in a 30-minute TV series.
Yeah. And if you want to do something with a lot of rapid back and forth banter, radio or television. All right. Well, I think at this point, it is time to say, thank you so much. You are out of excuses. Now go write. And if you'd like to support us, please join us, patreon.com/writingexcuses.
Thanks, everybody.